Denmark isn't known for its brutal murders. They do happen there, but it's rare. Denmark certainly isn't known for its serial killers, but one man would be released from prison after serving his sentence for murder, only to go on to commit a triple murder years later. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Marianne Pedersen was born in 1962. She met her husband, who was working as a painter but wasn't making a whole lot of money. After the pair had married and had 2 sons, Dennis and Brian, Marianne decided she needed to earn money somehow, and so she and her husband decided to open up what they called a massage clinic. But it turned out to be a brothel where Marianne would work herself to earn money as a sex worker. It wasn't too long after that Marianne's husband died. She continued living in the same Copenhagen suburb and working at the brothel. At the age of 36, she was working when a client came in to see her. The man's name was Peter Lundin. He would become more than just a regular client, and the pair started seeing each other romantically. They would see each other more and more often and eventually got into a relationship. One day, in the summer of 2000, Peter told Marianne's stepson Martin that she and her 2 sons, Brian and Dennis, had gone away on holiday. He said that he'd been left in charge of the house and she'd asked him to paint it for him whilst he was away. Now Martin found this odd. It wasn't like Marianne to just up and leave, and it certainly wasn't like her to just leave Peter in charge of the house. It wasn't long after that Martin paid his stepmom's house a visit. He went up to the door and on it he saw that there was a note. He opened up the note and it said that she and her 2 sons had gone on holiday. They had left Peter at the house so that he could paint it, and they would be back by the 28th of June. Now the 28th of June came and went and there was still no sign of her. And when Martin returned back to the house, this time a new note replaced that old one. And this one said that they were still on holiday, the boys had gone to a school summer camp, and they would be back on the 28th of July, so a further month later. Martin called the boys' school and asked them himself about the school camping trip, and the school told him that the boys had been booked onto that camping trip, but they'd never showed up. They'd never seen Dennis or Brian. Martin decided to go back to the house and he actually forced entry inside. And when he got inside, he noticed that the house was in absolute state. It was an utter mess. And when he looked closer, he could see that things were really out of whack. The furniture was moved closer into the centre of the room, away from the walls, and it was covered with plastic, almost as if someone was trying to clean up. As he made his way further through the house, he found in both of the toilets there was vomit, and there was rubbish strewn all about the house, all through the rooms. And as he went closer and closer to the basement area, he started to smell a strong stench. Now, he didn't know exactly what it was at that point, he just knew it wasn't good, and so he called the police to report Marianne, his stepmom, and his 2 stepbrothers, Dennis and Brian, as missing. By the time he reported them missing, it was the 3rd of July 2000, and he had tried everything to find out where they were. He'd obviously gone round to their house, he'd now called the police, and he'd been trying to call both Marianne and the boys since they went missing or since they left for this holiday, and he had no answer on any of their phones. Police came to the house and conducted their own search, and what they found was chilling. The whole house was scattered with bloodstains, and some of these were minute. You couldn't see them with the human eye. Some were much bigger. Either way, there were an awful lot of them. They found blood in Marianne's bed, they found it in the kitchen, and they even found it in between the tiles of the kitchen, as well as in the basement. When they had searched the kitchen initially, they'd taken a few things away that looked as though they could be of interest, and they realised that on the chopping board that was laid still out on the kitchen surface, that had traces of blood on it, as did the food blender that was also still laid out. They also found blood in Marianne's car. Now, all of this was obviously extremely worrying to police, and they needed to find Peter and speak to him as soon as possible. They went round to Peter's house, and when they got there, he answered the door and he seemed to be acting pretty normally and was very calm. He invited the officers inside and they sat down with him and began to talk with him, and he told them about his last conversation with Marianne. Peter told the police exactly the same story that he told her stepson Martin. He said that the last conversation they had was that Marianne was going on holiday, she was taking her sons, Dennis and Brian, and she had also asked him if he would look after the house and also paint some rooms, and that's why he had a key for the house, and that's why he had been the last one that was there. Police went on to search Peter's house, and while they were there, they found a number of suspicious items, and they were items belonging to Marianne. So the first thing they found was a loyalty card that had her name on it, and then they found a cutout from her passport, and it was the picture section and it was the signature section, and he couldn't explain to officers why he had these in his possession. However, when they went back to search Marianne's house yet again, they found even more evidence, and it began to give them a clearer picture of what might have happened that day, and so they began to build their case. It became clear that Marianne, Dennis and Brian had all been killed. The forensic evidence was clear, and not only that, but all three of them had also been dismembered in the house. The first dismemberment had taken place in the basement, and the other two dismemberments took place in the garage. At some point after the dismemberment, it became clear that Peter had stored some body parts in the freezer that was found on Marianne's property in a shed outside. And when they took this and did forensic testing on it, it was clear that the freezer had been cleaned, but just not very well, and so they were able to find that evidence, and they would later take that to trial. The forensics team also found human tissue that helped them, along with a number of other things, to determine that an angle grinder had been used, and they also found that there were ridge marks, cut marks on the floor of the basement, and that showed them that also an axe had been used. On the 5th of July 2000, Peter Lundin was arrested and charged with murder, and after being detained for 3 weeks, Peter told the prison guards to get the detective investigating the case so that he could do another statement. He hadn't been completely honest, he said, when he'd first spoken to police, and now he wanted to tell them the truth. He told the officers that on the evening of the 16th of June, or sometime into the early hours of the 17th of June, he'd heard screams coming from the basement area of the house. He said when he eventually went down there, he found the two boys, Dennis and Brian, lying in a pool of blood, and they were both deceased, and lying next to them was their mother, Marianne, and she was also lying next to a knife, but she wasn't dead, she was unconscious. He said he realised that she'd taken a load of drugs and fallen unconscious, and when he understood what she'd done, he said it made him fly into a rage. He couldn't control his emotions and his anger, and so he started hitting Marianne. He went on, while he was telling this story, to say that although he had hit Marianne, he said it wasn't, quote, that serious of a hit. And he said that despite the next thing he said being that she had died shortly after that. When the detective asked why he hadn't just called police when he came across this horrific scene, he said that he was worried the police wouldn't believe him because of his past. And he might have been right. Of course, his past wasn't the only thing that would lead the detectives to think that he had committed this horrific crime. The forensic evidence would do that just fine. Even so, his past was highly suspicious. Peter was born in February of 1972 in the Danish island of Zealand. He grew up partially in Denmark before his family moved to Ormond Beach, Florida when he was 9 years old. While living in the family home and attending school, some of Peter's teachers began to become a bit worried about him. They noticed that he was becoming more and more withdrawn, and he had a tendency to get quite aggressive in certain situations. They notified social services, who came and did an assessment of the home, and they accused Anna, his mother, of being guilty of abuse and child neglect. And so that caused them to then take Peter out of the home, and he went into foster care. Now, he was only in foster care for a total of 3 months, and he was eventually returned back into the care of both his mum and his dad. It's reported that on the night he was returned home to the care of his mum and dad, he actually suffered an attack by his mum, who attempted to strangle him. By the time Peter was 12 years old, his mum and dad actually split up, and he went to live with his dad, and they moved around quite a lot, moving from Los Angeles to New York to Boston and finally settling in Miami. Whilst they were living in Miami, and Peter was about 16 years old at this point, his mum actually moved back in and his mum and dad got back together, and by all accounts, Peter at this point thought that things would be okay and that they could all live as a family. But things would change quite significantly. Whereas before Anna had been the one abusing her son, this time Peter and his dad became the ones to abuse Anna, and Peter's 16 at this point. He's not a young child anymore. Now, alongside this, Peter at 16 is doing drugs, he has left school, and he is meeting people who he used to go to school with. Obviously, he has quit school, he's left, but he would meet up with them and he would deal drugs, he would sell them cannabis. He was the go-to person. All this time, his mum Anna was living with him, but she really wasn't treated like the mother of the house. Peter and his dad were high on drugs and often drunk, and so they would abuse Anna often. When things got really bad and the neighbours would hear the shouting and the violence that was happening in the house, they'd call police, and although police were called out a number of times and they did go to the residence, nothing was ever done and no arrests were ever made. Not much is known about exactly what happened next, but what we do know is that on the 1st of November 1991, some walkers were out on the beach in Buxton in North Carolina, and they were taking a trip out past the lighthouse there, and they came across a body that had been washed ashore. They called police, and when they recovered the body, they found that it had been wrapped in a blue blanket and then covered with black plastic before being wrapped with yellow rope and some tape. The police spent the next 4 months attempting to identify this body, and they didn't have much luck. That was until a missing persons report came in from Germany, and it had been matched to this body that they'd found, and that was some of Anna's family members back in Germany had reported her as missing, and so she was eventually identified. After that, the police started their search for the last 2 people that had seen Anna alive. That was her son and her husband, and they searched, but they couldn't find them straight away. They'd gone on the run. Peter and his dad fled the US and they actually went to Canada, and they were there for a good few months. The police actually wouldn't find them until June of the next year of 1993. And when they did find them, they were hiding out in a hotel room in Toronto. They were swiftly arrested and extradited back to the US for trial. It's reported that the likely events of what happened on the night of Anna's murder were that she had wanted to cut her son's hair. He's 19 at this point, so he's not a child anymore. He's not even really a teenager. He is becoming an adult, and she'd seen that he'd got really long hair. She didn't like it. She'd said it to him many times before, and so she came at him with a pair of scissors, and this enraged Peter. He didn't like being told what to do, and he certainly wasn't going to cut his hair, and so he lashed out back at his mum, and he ended up choking her to death. He used her own shirt to kill her, and then after she was lying on the floor, he left. He went to a party, and when he came back hours later and she was still lying there, that's when he realised that she really was dead. Peter told his dad, and his dad didn't call police. As we know, he said that he was going to help his son, and so they loaded Anna's body into the car. They drove up to the city of Buxton, and that's where together they dumped Anna's body. Peter never showed any remorse for killing his mum, instead saying, quote, "I could not see why the state should interfere with something that was a private matter, so obviously I did anything to escape. I did not want to go to a prison for something that was an accident, something that was a private matter." In July of 1993, Peter was found guilty and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder, and his dad was sentenced to 2 years as an accomplice. His dad did serve that 2-year sentence, and on his release he was made to go back to Denmark, and Peter served just 15 years of his sentence. And the reason that was given for his early release was because of overcrowding in the prison in North Carolina at that time. Just before Peter was released, he was interviewed by a Danish TV channel. And in that televised interview, he paints his face, half of it is white and half of it is black. And he told the interviewer that was to symbolise good and evil. Now, after the interview, a psychiatrist awarded Peter a score of 39 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist. Quote, Peter London is the purest and clearest psychopath I have ever known. His psychopathy rating is standalone, and it's important to note that after this, he was examined by a number of medical professionals and he was found not insane. He was fit to stand trial for the crimes that he committed. During Peter's time in prison, he spent a lot of time writing to women and becoming romantically involved with numerous different women. The number of women contacting him actually significantly increased after he appeared on that Danish TV show in that interview. One of the women that he was writing to and got to know was a woman called Tina. And whilst he was in prison, he actually got married to her. And so when he left prison, when he was released in 2000, he moved in with Tina and her teenage daughter. And then in early 2000, Tina gave birth to her second child and her and Peter's first child, a little baby boy called Nicholas. The situation didn't last long though. And now that Peter was out of prison, his violent tendencies, he was able to really realise them. And he ended up beating up Tina and threatening her daughter, and so Tina kicked him out of the house, and their relationship was sort of on and off for a little while, but ultimately at this point they were broken up and he was kicked out of the house. And he would later say that the only reason that he married Tina in the first place was so that he would have somewhere to live when he got out of jail. With that, he did need somewhere else to live, and so he went into a men's home in another area of Copenhagen. It was whilst he was there that he started visiting Marianne's massage parlour or brothel. That's where he met her, and that's where our story started today. And so after Peter had told the detective that this was the reason why he hadn't just called the police when he'd found Dennis and Brian's body, they questioned him more and more. It took a while, but eventually Peter confessed to killing Marianne and her two sons. He said that he overheard Marianne talking on the phone to someone, to another man, and he heard her talking, quote, sweetly to him. He became enraged and started arguing with her, and Dennis and Brian heard this and came into the bedroom to try and protect their mum. They all got into a bit of a scuffle on Marianne's double bed, and this is when Peter says he snapped and he broke all three of their necks. Although this doesn't ring true with the forensic evidence that was found, showing that at least 2 fatalities happened in the basement and not upstairs, as Peter said. A police reconstruction that was built from the evidence found also showed that Peter's blood had been found on the double bed upstairs in Marianne's room, and this probably happened, they theorised, from the youngest boy Brian biting Peter on the hand in an act of defence, trying to defend himself or his brother or his mum. And it's likely then that the boy did escape the room and Peter went after him. He did manage to catch him up, and then he was killed elsewhere. Peter went on to say that once he killed them, he did actually leave the house for a short time, and when he came back he noticed the stench of decomposition, and so that's when he decided to take the bodies and put them in the freezer to try and stop that smell and stop decomposition. As part of the investigation, Peter's dad had his house searched and a number of Marianne's belongings were found there too. Peter pleaded not guilty to the 3 murders. Now, the prosecution thought that Peter might admit deliberate manslaughter, but when he didn't, the case went to trial. Peter maintained that he didn't kill Marianne, Brian or Dennis. Evidence was presented at trial to show that on the 19th of June, 2 days after the murder, Peter had gone to a cash and carry type shop, a Metro, where he bought a number of supplies to help with the cleanup. These included rubber gloves, plastic bags, cleaning supplies and an axe. And after he had those, he got to work on dismembering the bodies. Once he'd done that, he put each of the various body parts in different bags, and then he got to work on choosing where to dispose of them. He had put some of those in the outside bin, which by this point, of course, had been collected, and those rubbish bags had been taken to the incinerator. And the bags that wouldn't fit in those outside bins were loaded into Marianne's car, and then he drove around and he just looked for bins and then disposed of various bags in different bins around the island of Zealand. The investigating teams did go on to search the areas where those rubbish bags would have gone onto, including over 10,000 tonnes of slag heap and waste bins nearby. They did this with help from the Danish Emergency pregnancy management agency, but they didn't find anything. Ultimately, Peter was found guilty of intentional murder and manslaughter. The defence pleaded for Peter to just get 16 years in prison, saying that he had acted spontaneously and it had been a spur-of-the-moment action. The jury ended up deliberating for just 10 minutes and Peter was given a life sentence. As for Peter's dad, it was found that he was not guilty of having helped dispose of the bodies, and he apparently didn't know anything about it. But he of course did have some of Marianne's possessions, and so he was charged with theft, and he was sentenced to 4 months in prison, which he served in 2002. Whilst Peter was in prison this time, he was contacted again by a woman called Marianne Pedersen. Now, Marianne is someone that had previously contacted Peter when he was in prison for the murder of his mum a few years earlier. She first had contacted him after she'd seen his interview with that Danish TV channel. Now, at that point, she'd been just 15 years old. Even so, she contacted Peter and he wrote back, and the two started a sort of pen pal relationship. And so then in 2006, when Peter was back in prison, this time for the triple murder, he and Marianne started talking again. And in 2008, the pair got married. In the time that they had been together, they had seen each other whilst Peter was in prison, and they'd had a sexual relationship, and Marianne became pregnant. Now, she didn't want to keep the baby and she had an abortion, and her and Peter did stay together for a little while after that. The couple had actually only been married 11 days when Marianne found out that he was talking to a number of other women in a romantic way, and so she decided to start divorce proceedings. Peter still maintains his innocence to this day, saying that Marianne, Brian and Dennis's deaths were accidental, and to this day in 2023 their bodies have still never been found. Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. I really appreciate you being here. If you have enjoyed today's video, please click the thumbs up button, and I just wanted to say the biggest thank you to Poppy, Misha and Deborah for sponsoring our Buy Me a Coffee, or sponsoring buying a coffee on buymeacoffee.com. I was trying to raise some money for some new lights and they have helped me get there. So thank you so much. I appreciate it beyond words. And I can't wait to bring you guys more content. I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.